By the mid-2000s, Sony and Nintendo were in fierce competition. The handheld market was hotting up. Nintendo had the mighty DS, and Sony with their PlayStation Portable. Both systems were very successful for their respective companies, with many brilliant games developed. But what tools were used to make these games? We already took a look at the Nintendo DS, but what about the Sony PlayStation? So about a month ago on the channel, we took a look at the Nintendo DS development kit, the IS Nitro Debugger, and this is the Sony PSP dev kit. And although there is a lot of differences, there also are some similarities. And back in the kind of mid-2000s, when we talked about development of games on handheld systems like the DS and the PSP, then typically you would get a setup like this where there was kind of like a base system that was like the command center that would allow you to do all the coding and debugging on, but you would also get what was known as, in this instance at least for the PSP, a controller arm. And this essentially is just a PSP that is tethered via USB and another kind of proprietary input to the main development kit here. And essentially this acts as the controller for the dev kit. If you think about it, when you get a development kit, you will get a controller obviously to test your games on. But it's important to note that this is a custom PSP controller provided only with use for the development kit. It's not a real PSP, although it may look like it from the front, and the inside motherboard is completely different from a retail system. It also doesn't have the UMD slot or any other features that you would expect on a retail PSP. Its main task is to output to the screen so developers can see what their games would look like on a real PSP. So let's go ahead and walk through the features of the PSP development kit. Now the first thing to note is the Umd Drive. Now the Umd Drive has been moved from the controller onto the development hardware itself. And this was something that was typical of development kits at the time. Now if we press eject here, you can insert a regular retail UMD, and depending on the settings that you have on your dev kit, you can actually read and play retail discs on a PSP dev kit. Now there are a couple of constraints here and there, but that's something that is a little different than what we normally found with development kits, where you weren't able to actually read and play retail games unless there was some type of patch or hack that you applied. The PSP dev kit contains a DVD drive and a UMD drive, and depending on what setting this was set to, you could actually burn your games onto DVD and play them from there instead of using the UMD. Now this was a really cool feature for developers to burn their games on a DVD to kind of simulate final retail before actually getting them pressed onto UMD drive. So this was a nice touch, and if you actually change this over to DVD, then the DVD drive will be accessed and you can burn your games onto a DVD in just kind of standard ISO format that the PSP can understand, and you can load and run your games from the DVD player. Now the power switch obviously turns the dev kit on and off. Now when you turn on the dev kit, it probably takes about 60 seconds for it to initialize and power up. So the first time you turn on a dev kit, a PSP dev kit, it just kind of starts flashing green, and it looks like that nothing is happening and maybe that there's a problem with the dev kit, but it's really all it's doing is just powering itself up, it's initializing, and then it will come to life eventually. But it is something that if you are getting a PSP dev kit for the first time or you're interested in checking out, just give it a little bit of time to get initialized, because it does probably take about a minute or so to get powered up. Now moving further down, we've got a couple of buttons for System Init and Network Init. Essentially these just kind of do factory resets of the settings. It initializes the system. If the network was previously set to something else, this will just clear out the settings and set it to defaults. Further down we have the connector for the controller, which connects to the PSP controller itself as well as USB. And then we have these general purpose I/O ports where you can basically use this to do anything that you want. It's something, again, that is found on many different PlayStation, Sony development kit hardware. The GPIO ports there on the PS4, the PS3, they're kind of something that Sony really likes to use on their development hardware. Now, if you look at the back of the PSP dev kit, we've got an aerial here for wireless Ethernet. And then if we kind of pan down, we also have a wired Ethernet connection. And obviously this is the preferred option to use in most scenarios. We have our power outlet here to just go into our AC adapter, of course. We also have a VGA out where we can pipe our video output to a VGA display to do things like captures and things like that. And we'll take a closer look at that here shortly. And we also have audio out as well if we want to route our audio to a mixer or something along those lines. But there's also a connector here that says foot switch. Now, the dev kit came with a piece of plastic that you could put under your desk. And this is what it looks like right here. What would happen is when the developer was testing their code, if they wanted to hit a breakpoint or bring up the debugger immediately while they were testing their games, they would just press their foot onto this switch, and that would then stop the execution of the game that they were working on, effectively allowing them to debug their game. And this is a pretty interesting thing because I've never seen anything like this before. I've never seen a foot switch. Usually you just, press the brake button on the compiler, but this will actually stop the execution of the game. And I think that's a pretty interesting idea. I've never seen anything like this before on development hardware, so I thought that was pretty cool. So as you can see here, the PSP controller looks identical to a retail system. The only difference that we have here is the debug settings. And one of the interesting things about a PSP dev kit, again, pretty much the same as many other dev kits, is you have the ability to have either 32 megabytes, which is the standard retail amount of system memory, or 64 megabytes. Now, this was obviously something that developers would take advantage of in order to debug their games while they were building them. There's also other features in here on the debug settings. None of them are particularly that interesting to anyone other than really developers at the time, but you could also have different debugger modes and also kind of things that if you're familiar with PlayStation hardware, like the NP environments and the NP debugs, that you could turn off and on. Now, the other thing to note here is that this particular PlayStation dev kit has been updated to the latest firmware, which is 6.60, I believe. So if we go down and take a look at the system information, you can see here that we're running 6.60. Now, as with any development kit, there needs to be a way to write code and compile them on the dev kit itself. And the PSP has its own development SDK that can be installed on a PC and run. There are two main ways to interface with a PSP via the PC. The first is to use a web browser. The PSP dev kit runs Linux and an internal web server, which can be used to interface to and control various things. The most notable is the boot mode setting, which can switch between debugging and PSP system software mode. Debugging is the default option, and PSP system mode puts the dev kit into release mode, which can allow for some retail UMD disks to be loaded and played. The second and more important tool on the PC side is known as Target Manager. This tool allows connection to the dev kit, and code can be pushed over the network. When the developer was compiling code, if the PSP was previously set up, the binary data would automatically be sent to the dev kit, and this is pretty standard stuff if you've developed on consoles before. So if we take a quick look at the internals, it resembles a small form factor PC of the era, and inside, the DVD looks like it connects with a standard IDE interface. There's also a dedicated power supply as well, but the dev kit motherboard is completely custom, as we would expect. Now, one final thing that the dev kit supports, as mentioned, is an external output to a VGA display. Now, this is connected to a LCD display. Now, one of the things that you may note is that this has a limitation in that you can't actually expand the screen size and maintain a aspect ratio. So this is essentially what you're going to get. You're going to get these kind of ugly black borders around the output, but this isn't really, I guess, the main purpose of this. It's really just to test games and have a larger display on the developer's desk to build their games and test them on. But I will say that the image quality here, while it's decent, is nowhere near as good as the component outputs you would get on something like the PSP Go, which has far superior output over something like this. But this really, the main purpose of this really was just to have an external display for developers to build their games on and test them without having to resort, at all times at least, to the controller that's attached to the dev kit itself. So there you have it. That is the PlayStation Portable PSP DTP-T1000 development kit. Very interesting piece of tech, and something that really just screams mid-2000s game development. And I absolutely love the system. It's so awesome to mess around with. Now, before I go, I want to give a huge thank you to Marco, a friend of the show, someone that's regularly in my comments, who actually was the person that hooked me up with both the Nintendo DS dev kit from the previous episode and this one. He was able to locate both of these dev kits over in Taiwan at the Taipei City Mall. This is not a sponsored bit or anything, but I wanted to give him a huge shout out for acquiring me these kits. This particular store, if you are living in Taiwan or you are planning on visiting Taipei, then check out this store because they have seemingly a lot of really interesting, cool gadgets and gizmos, more dev kits, and maybe this is something that I'll pick up more of and bring over to the US and show off on the channel next year, but that does remain to be seen. But just want to give Marco and the store a huge thanks, and I'll leave a link to the store in the description below. I can't pronounce the name of the store, but I'll let people know if they are interested in checking it out if you are ever over in Taipei. But for now, guys, we are going to leave it here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.